Birthdays are supposed to taste like cheap frosting and bad champagne. Mine tasted like copper and old regret. I was 26 when my older sister slid a sleek, silver-wrapped box across our parents' mahogany dining table, smiled her pageant queen smile, and handed me a DNA test. "Just in case," she said. "You can always smell the tension in my parents' house before you feel it. It smells like lemon-scented floor wax and burnt rosemary. My mother, Susan, cooks with a kind of aggressive anxiety, burning the edges of the roast while leaving the center bleeding, as if the meat itself is being punished for not cooking faster." I stood in the entryway on my 26th birthday, peeling off a wet wool coat that smelled like the damp subway commute I'd just endured. The house was too warm. It was always too warm, suffocatingly so, trapped behind heavy velvet curtains that trapped the heat and the stale air. "You're tracking mud, Nora." I didn't have to look up to know it was Madison. My older sister, by 3 years, standing in the archway of the dining room with a glass of dry Pinot Noir balanced between two perfectly manicured fingers. Madison always looked like she had just been unboxed. Not a hair out of place, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that practically dared the world to spill something on it. She smelled of sandalwood and expensive arrogance. "It's just water, Maddie," I muttered, kicking off my boots and nudging them against the baseboard. My socks were damp at the toes. A fantastic start. "Well, it's soaking into the oak," she replied, taking a slow sip of her wine. Her eyes raked over me, my oversized vintage sweater, the faded denim, the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of drugstore concealer could completely bury. She didn't say anything else, but the loud, deliberate swallow of her wine spoke volumes. "You don't fit in here." She wasn't wrong. Dinner was a masterclass in domestic avoidance. We sat at the long mahogany table, the four of us spread out like delegates from warring nations. Dad Arthur sat at the head, meticulously sawing his portion of the roast beef into uniform, half-inch squares. His jaw clicked every time he chewed. It was the only sound in the room for a solid 5 minutes, save for the rhythmic times, scrape-clink times of silverware against fine china. I kept my eyes on my plate. The potatoes were cold. The gravy had formed that weird, gelatinous skin on top. I pushed it around with my fork, feeling the dull ache of an impending migraine starting at the base of my skull. "So, Nora," Mom said, breaking the silence with the grace of a dropped cinder block. "Any movement on the job front, or are we still pouring lattes for teenagers?" "I manage the cafe, Mom. I don't just pour lattes. And we're opening a second location in the spring," I said. My voice sounded thin, defensive. I hated that. I hated how quickly this house stripped me back down to a defensive teenager. "A second location," Dad echoed, not looking up from his meat. "Fascinating." He said the word the way someone else might say time's tragic. Madison chuckled softly. She reached for the butter dish. "It's good she has a passion, Dad. Some people just aren't built for the corporate ladder. We can't all have the drive." I bit the inside of my cheek. The metallic taste of blood blossomed on my tongue. I pressed my teeth into the flesh until the pain grounded me, keeping me tethered to the chair when every muscle in my legs wanted to stand up and walk out into the freezing November rain. This was the dynamic. It had always been the dynamic. Madison was the golden child, fair-haired, sharp-featured, built for boardrooms and country clubs. She inherited Dad's height and Mom's bone structure. I was a foot shorter, built softer, with heavy, dark hair and hazel eyes that matched absolutely no one in the family tree. Growing up, the differences were just visual. As we got older, the gap widened into personality, ambition, and worth. "I'm perfectly happy with my drive, Madison," I said, finally looking up at her. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you are, sweetie. Blissful ignorance is still bliss." The dinner dragged on. The roast was cleared, replaced by a dense, suffocatingly sweet chocolate cake from the expensive bakery downtown. It was Madison's favorite, on my birthday. Mom sliced it with a heavy silver cake knife, sliding a piece onto my plate that was roughly the size of a doorstop. "Make a wish, Nora," Mom said, her voice tight, eager to get the ceremonial part over with. I didn't close my eyes. I just leaned forward, smelled the thick, artificial fondant, and blew out the single candle they'd bothered to stick in the center. The smoke drifted up, smelling like burnt cotton string, stinging my nostrils. "Happy birthday," Dad mumbled, checking his Rolex. "Yes, happy birthday," Madison chimed in. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs groaning against the hardwood floor. I have something for you. She walked to the sideboard and returned with a rectangular box wrapped in heavy, textured silver paper. It looked expensive. The ribbon alone probably cost more than my shift wages for the day. She set it down directly in front of my plate, right next to the slice of cake I had no intention of eating. I wasn't sure what to get you, Madison said, taking her seat again. She rested her chin on her hands, elbows on the table, a breach of Mom's strict etiquette that went entirely ignored. You're always so hard to shop for. Your tastes are so unique. I stared at the box. It was light. It didn't rattle. You didn't have to get me anything, I said, and I meant it. The last thing Madison had given me was a self-help book on time management. The year before that, a gym membership. Every gift was a thinly veiled critique wrapped in an obligation. Nonsense. Open it. Her eyes were bright. Too bright. There was a weird, electric anticipation radiating from her side of the table. I slid a fingernail under the tape. The paper was so thick it put up a fight, refusing to tear easily. I had to peel it back in jagged strips, exposing the plain white cardboard underneath. Then, a logo. A stylized strand of DNA in bright, cheerful colors. Ancestry origins. I stopped breathing for a second. Just 1 second. Long enough for the silence in the room to suddenly feel very loud. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stared at the words on the box. Discover your roots. Uncover your true history. I didn't understand. Or rather, I refused to let my brain process what my eyes were seeing. I looked up. Dad was staring fixedly at his water glass. Mom was suddenly very interested in smoothing out an invisible wrinkle in the linen tablecloth. Neither of them was looking at me. Neither of them was looking at Madison. A DNA test? I asked, my voice flat. Madison let out a sharp, nasal laugh. It bounced off the walls, brittle and mean. Well, yeah. I mean, look at you, Nora. Look at us. She gestured broadly between her face and mine. We've been joking about it for years. I just figured, since you're so clearly another man's mistake, it was time we finally found out which man's. The words hung over the table like a bad smell. Another man's mistake. The sheer audacity of it didn't compute at first. My brain short-circuited, trying to find the punchline, trying to map out the appropriate social response to a sister calling you a bastard child at your own birthday dinner. I expected Mom to gasp. I expected Dad to slam his hand on the table and demand respect. They did nothing. Dad cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. Madison. That's a bit much for the dinner table. Not times, that's a lie. Not times, how dare you say that to your sister. Just, not at the dinner table. Mom didn't even look up. It's just a joke, Nora. Don't be so sensitive. You know how your sister's humor is. I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers went cold, the tips tingling as if I'd plunged my hands into ice water. The room tilted, just slightly, the edges of my vision blurring. I wasn't heroic. I wasn't angry yet. I was just profoundly, deeply embarrassed. My stomach knotted, a wave of nausea rolling through me so violently I thought I was going to throw up the cheap wine directly onto the mahogany table. A joke, I repeated. The word felt like gravel in my mouth. Oh, don't look like a kicked dog, Madison sighed, rolling her eyes. It's a novelty gift. People do them all the time to find out if they're Irish or whatever. If you can't take a little ribbing. She was enjoying this. The slight flush on her neck, the wide, unblinking stare. She was feeding on my discomfort, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to storm out like a child so she could play the victim of my overreactions. A cold, heavy weight dropped into my stomach, replacing the nausea. It wasn't rage. It was a bizarre, almost terrifying clarity. I looked down at the box. I looked at the plastic seal. My hands were shaking. I hated that they were shaking. I wanted to look cool and detached, but my fingers were trembling so badly I couldn't get a grip on the plastic tab. I dug my thumbnail in, aggressively tearing the cardboard. A sharp edge caught my cuticle, slicing the skin. A tiny bead of bright red blood welled up. "Nora, what are you doing?" Mom asked, finally looking up, her voice tinged with panic at the sight of potential stains. "Don't bleed on the linen." I ignored her. I pulled the plastic tube out of the box. It was a simple collection kit, a small plastic funnel attached to a vial, with a line indicating how much saliva was needed. "You want to know?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. It didn't even sound like me. It sounded like a stranger, someone older and vastly more tired. "Nora, put that away!" Dad snapped, his face reddening. I popped the cap off the funnel. The plastic made a sharp Times click. I didn't break eye contact with Madison. I brought the tube to my lips. My mouth was incredibly dry, a side effect of the adrenaline flooding my system. I had to bite the inside of my cheek again, tasting the copper again, working up the moisture. And then, right there at the dinner table, over the remnants of the roast and the untouched birthday cake, I spit into the tube. It was a gross, visceral sound. Hawk. Spit. Madison recoiled, her chair scraping backward, her face contorted into genuine disgust. "Jesus Christ, Nora, you're an animal. What is wrong with you?" "Madison, language!" Mom shrieked. I didn't stop. I worked up more saliva, letting it pool in my mouth, and spit again. It took 3 tries to reach the fill line. Each time, the sound was louder, more deliberate. It was the most disgusting, inappropriate thing I could possibly do in my mother's pristine dining room, and it felt incredible. I unscrewed the funnel, screwed on the tight plastic cap containing the stabilizing fluid, and shook it. The liquid turned cloudy. I slammed the tube down onto the table. It hit the wood with a hard times thwack, right next to Madison's wine glass. "There," I said, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. I smeared a little bit of blood from my cut finger onto my chin, but I didn't care. "I'll drop it in the mail tomorrow. We wouldn't want to keep you waiting on your punchline." Madison was staring at the tube like it was a live grenade. Dad was rubbing his temples. "You are so deeply unstable," Madison whispered, though she looked a little pale. "Happy birthday to me," I said. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked out of the dining room. My legs felt like lead. I just wanted to get to the front door, get my wet boots on, and disappear into the night. I made it to the hallway. I shoved my feet into the cold, damp boots without tying the laces. I threw my heavy coat over my shoulders. I reached for the doorknob, and then I realized I didn't have my keys. They were sitting on the edge of the sideboard in the dining room, right next to the cake. I stood there by the door for a full 10 seconds, closing my eyes, cursing the universe for not letting me have a clean exit. The dramatic tension was ruined. The cinematic walkout was a failure. I had to turn around, walk back into the dining room where the 3 of them were sitting in stunned, horrified silence, and awkwardly shuffle past my father to grab my keyring. The keys jingled loudly in the quiet room. "I forgot these," I mumbled, my face burning so hot I thought it might melt off my skull. Nobody said a word. I walked back out, the heavy front door shutting behind me with a loud, final click, leaving me alone in the freezing rain with a bleeding finger, no umbrella, and a sudden, terrifying suspicion that my sister's cruel joke hadn't been a joke at all. I actually mailed it. I didn't think I would. I kept the kit sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 days, right next to a bowl of softening lemons and a stack of past-due electric bills. Every morning, while waiting for the cheap drip coffee maker to sputter out its dark, bitter sludge, I would stare at the white cardboard box. It felt radioactive. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, it was raining again. A relentless, freezing drizzle that made the city look like it was covered in dirty cellophane. I shoved the box into my canvas tote bag alongside my apron and walked to the blue USPS mailbox on the corner of 44th and Pine. The metal handle was cold and slick with grime. I pulled it down, tossed the box inside, and let it snap shut. The hollow times clang times echoed down the quiet street. It was done. The waiting period was a bizarre study in cognitive dissonance. For the first 2 weeks, I convinced myself Madison was just being her usual brand of sadistic. She was a woman who once told me my high school graduation dress made me look like a festive bruised plum. Cruelty was just her love language, translated through the dialect of a bored sociopath. But then, the memories started to creep in. The quiet, insidious little moments from my childhood that I had willfully smoothed over. Dad taking Madison to the hardware store on Saturday mornings, telling me there wasn't enough room in the truck. The truck had a bench seat. Mom meticulously assembling photo albums where I was always on the periphery. A dark-haired, heavy-browed blur standing next to her 2 golden, sharp-featured family members, the way they never talked about my birth. There were no funny stories about the hospital, no nostalgic sighing over my first steps. I had just arrived, it seemed, a heavy piece of furniture they hadn't measured the doorway for, forced to fit into a space that wasn't built to accommodate it. The email arrived on a Thursday evening, 32 days after the birthday dinner. I had just gotten off a 10-hour shift at the cafe. My shoes were sticky with dried oat milk and hazelnut syrup. The radiator in my tiny apartment was hissing and clanking, fighting a losing battle against the December draft leaking through the single-pane windows. I was sitting on my secondhand sofa, eating cold pad thai straight from the cardboard carton, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. A notification dropped down from the top of the screen. Ancestry Origins. Your results are ready. I stopped chewing. The peanut sauce suddenly tasted like ash. My thumb hovered over the notification for a long time. The hissing of the radiator seemed to grow louder, filling the room with a high-pitched, metallic whine. I tapped the screen. The app loaded slowly, the little cartoon DNA strand spinning in endless circles. My chest felt tight. I took a shallow breath, smelling the garlic and old oil from my takeout, mixing with the damp wool smell of my sweater. The screen bloomed into color. A pie chart. 48% British and Irish. 32% French. 20% broadly Northwestern European. I exhaled. A shaky, pathetic little laugh escaped my lips. European. Just normal, boring European. No scandalous surprises. I scrolled down, looking for the familial matches section, ready to take a screenshot and send it to Madison with a middle finger emoji. The page refreshed. Close family matches. Madison Hayes. I blinked. My sister's name was right there. She had taken the test. Of course she had. Madison never did anything unless she already knew the outcome. I looked at the text beneath her name. The letters were small, crisp, and entirely devoid of emotion. Estimated relationship. Half-sister. Shared DNA. 24.8%. The cold pad thai slipped from my hands, the carton hitting the cheap laminate flooring with a dull splat. Noodles scattered across the rug. I didn't care. I didn't even look at the mess. I stared at the words until they lost all meaning. Half-sister. I scrolled further. The app suggested a list of potential fathers based on distant cousin matches, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the gaping void where Arthur Hayes should have been. It all clicked into place with the sickening, violent precision of a car crash. Madison had known. She had taken this test months ago, seen the half-sibling marker, and realized that one of us didn't belong to Arthur. And since Madison was a walking, talking carbon copy of the man, the math wasn't hard to do. She hadn't bought the test as a joke, she had bought it as a weapon. She wanted me to find out through a plastic tube and a sterile app notification because she didn't have the guts to say it outright. Or worse, Mom and Dad knew, and they had let her do it. A weird, buzzing numbness spread through my limbs. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion. 26 years of trying to earn a man's love, trying to figure out why I was so fundamentally unlovable to him. Why I was always the awkward, clumsy outsider. It wasn't because I wasn't smart enough. It wasn't because I preferred brewing coffee over reading quarterly earnings reports. It was because every time Arthur Hayes looked at me, he saw another man. I didn't call Madison. Calling her would give her the satisfaction of my hysteria. Instead, I waited until Sunday morning. Sunday was their ritual. Church at 9 a.m., brunch at the country club at 11 a.m., back home by 1 p.m. to read the Sunday papers in heavy, oppressive silence. I parked my rusted Honda Civic in the wide, paved driveway at 1:30 p.m. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a brittle, bone-chilling cold. The manicured hedges lining the walkway looked sharp, like they could cut you if you brushed against them. I let myself in with the spare key I wasn't supposed to know was hidden under the fake rock by the porch. The house smelled exactly the same. Lemon wax, old money, suffocation. I found them in the sunroom. The irony of the room's name was never lost on me. It was the coldest room in the house, surrounded by glass that let the winter in. Mom was sitting on the floral love seat, a cashmere throw draped over her legs, reading a thick biography. Dad was in his leather armchair, sorting through the mail with a silver letter opener. They looked up when my boots thudded against the hardwood threshold. "Nora," Mom said, her voice registering mild annoyance rather than surprise. We didn't know you were coming. You're tracking salt onto the rugs. I didn't take my boots off. I walked right to the center of the room. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded printout. I hadn't bothered to put it in an envelope. I just unfolded the crinkled printer paper and dropped it onto the glass coffee table, right on top of a stack of Architectural Digest magazines. 24.8%, I said. My voice was raspy. I hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days. Dad paused, the silver letter opener hovering over a credit card offer. He looked at the paper, then at me. His expression didn't change. It was a terrifying, stony blankness. Mom set her book down. She leaned forward, squinting at the paper. I watched her eyes scan the highlighted text. Half-sister. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the denial. Mom just slowly sank back into the floral upholstery. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking old. Just a tired, terrified, aging woman in an expensive sweater. Madison gave me the kit for my birthday, I said, the words falling like lead weights onto the glass table. But you already knew that, didn't you? Nora, Mom started, her voice cracking. It was a pathetic, reedy sound. Did she know? I looked at Dad. He was staring at the paper now. She suspected, Dad said. His voice was calm, conversational. It made my stomach turn. Madison is very observant. She took a test in college. She brought the results to me. To you, I repeated. Not to Mom. Dad finally looked up at me. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. Your mother and I had an arrangement. A long time ago. Before you were born. It was a difficult period in our marriage. An arrangement, I echoed, tasting the sheer sterile absurdity of the word. I am an arrangement. I'm a difficult period. Mom started to cry. It was a quiet, refined weeping, dabbing at her eyes with the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. We wanted to protect you, Nora. We wanted to keep the family together. Arthur was so generous to stay. To raise you. Raise me? I laughed. The sound was harsh and wet in the quiet room. He didn't raise me, Mom. He tolerated me. He let me live in his house while he punished you by punishing me. Every single day of my life, he looked at me and saw whatever guy you slept with. Don't speak to your mother that way, Dad snapped, a flicker of real anger, finally, defending his property. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The graying temples, the sharp jawline that Madison wore so proudly. He wasn't a monster. He was just a coward. A man too proud to leave his cheating wife, but too bitter to love the child that came from it. Who is he? I asked, looking back at Mom. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just shook her head, burying her face in her hands. It doesn't matter, Dad said, dismissing the question with a wave of his hand, as if we were discussing a mismatched piece of furniture. He's not in the picture. He never was. I stood there in the freezing sunroom, wearing my damp coat, my boots dripping salty slush onto the expensive Persian rug. I had spent hours driving around the city the night before, practicing speeches in my head. I had imagined screaming, throwing things, demanding apologies on my hands and knees. But looking at them now, sitting in their sterile, perfect house, wrapped in decades of lies and resentment, I felt nothing but pity. They were trapped here with each other. I wasn't. You're right, I said softly. The anger had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, echoing peace. It doesn't matter. Mom looked up, her mascara slightly smudged. Nora, please, we're still your family. No, Susan, I said, and the use of her first name made her flinch as if I'd struck her. You're Madison's family. I'm just a guest who overstayed her welcome. I turned around. I didn't wait for Dad to formulate a stern reprimand. I didn't wait for Mom to offer a hollow apology. I just walked back through the house, my heavy boots thudding against the oak floors, leaving wet, dirty footprints all the way to the front door. I stepped out into the biting winter air and closed the heavy oak door behind me. I didn't slam it. I just shut it, listening to the solid click times of the latch falling into place. I got into my rusted Civic, turned the key, and listened to the engine sputter and roar to life. I turned the heater on full blast, blowing stale, dusty air into my face. It smelled like cheap coffee and old fabric. It smelled like mine. I put the car in drive, backed out of the pristine driveway, and drove back toward the city, leaving the ghosts behind in the suburbs where they belonged. Thank you so much for reading this story. If you felt the emotional weight of Nora's journey, or just love a good raw family drama, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a story about finding your own worth when your family won't give it to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the messy, beautiful reality of human relationships. See you next time.